Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The wind began it. A low thrumming in the copper beech that stood sentinel beside our old Victorian house. It was not a storm wind, nor a gentle breeze, but something in between. A persistent, rhythmic exhalation that made the dry autumn leaves scrape against the clapboard with a sound like whispering teeth. I stood at the kitchen window, a dish towel in my hand, and watched the branches sway, a slow, hypnotic dance against a sky the color of dull slate. That sound, that scraping, it slipped into the silence of the house, into the silence that had been growing around my daughter for weeks, and it seemed to carry a message I could not decipher. A single word repeated on a loop, just below the threshold of hearing. Cora was 7. She'd been a child of light and noise, a whirlwind of crayons and laughter and questions that fell like summer rain. Now, she was a still pool. She would sit for hours in the bay window of the living room, her small hands folded in her lap, staring out at the beech tree as if waiting for a guess. The change had been glacial, so slow I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. A forgotten word here, a skipped meal there. The pediatrician called it anxiety, a possible precursor to selective mutism. He gave us a referral to a child psychologist and a pamphlet. The pamphlet felt flimsy in my hands, a poor shield against the creeping cold that was settling into the bones of my home, into the eyes of my child. Her silence was the worst of it. It wasn't an empty silence, but a thick, substantive thing, a held breath that filled the rooms. You could feel the pressure of it in your ears. Then, the sound started. Not from her, but from her room at night. A low, wet clicking, like a tongue dislodging from the roof of a mouth. I would creep down the hall, my heart a frantic bird against my ribs, and push her door open a crack. She would be lying perfectly still in her bed, her eyes wide open, gleaming in the dark. The clicking would have stopped the moment my shadow fell across the floor. The air in her room always smelled faintly metallic, like old pennies and damp soil. My husband, Paul, had left 6 months before the wind started. He couldn't handle the quiet, he said. I think now he felt it before I did, the wrongness. And he was simply the first to flee. So it was just me and Cora, and the house, and the whispering beech tree. I tried everything the doctor suggested. I made her favorite foods, macaroni and cheese shaped like cartoon characters. I read her old stories, my voice trembling with a false cheer that echoed in the stifling air. I bought her a kitten, a tiny mewling thing she named Mr. Paws. For a day, she seemed to brighten, her small fingers gently stroking its fur. The next morning, I found Mr. Paws in the laundry basket, cold and stiff, its neck broken with a neat, precise twist. Cora was in the bay window. When I asked her, my voice a shattered thing, "What happened?" she turned her head slowly and looked at me. Her eyes were not a child's eyes. They were ancient, flat, and held a cold, surgical curiosity. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. That was the day I stopped calling doctors and started calling churches. The first priest was young, fresh from the seminary, his faith a bright new coin. Father Colby. He came with a kind smile and a small bottle of holy water. He sat with Cora in the living room while I hovered in the doorway. He spoke to her of God's love, his voice gentle and reassuring. Cora watched the beech tree. Then, as he finished a prayer, she turned that flat, ancient gaze on him and spoke. Her voice was not her own. It was a guttural rasp, a sound dredged from a deep, lightless place. It said one word: counterfeit. Father Colby flinched as if struck. The color drained from his face. He stood up so quickly his chair scraped back with a shriek. He mumbled an excuse, his eyes wide with a terror I now recognized, and he almost ran from my house. I never saw him again. It was he who sent Father Devon. Where Colby was new, Devon was weathered. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands gnarled and speckled with age, but his eyes were a calm, steady blue. He did not bring a bright smile. He brought a worn leather bag and a demeanor of immense, tired gravity. He didn't ask to see Cora right away. Instead, he walked through the house, his footsteps silent on the old floors. He paused in the doorway of her room, his nostrils flaring slightly at the coppery smell. He stood for a long time at the kitchen window, watching the beech tree sway in that ceaseless wind. "This has been here a long time," he said, his voice low and raspy. It wasn't a question. He finally sat with Cora in the living room. He didn't offer platitudes or prayers. He simply sat, watching her. She ignored him for a full 10 minutes, her profile pale and sharp against the gray light from the window. Then, slowly, her head rotated towards him. It was a movement of such unnatural, mechanical precision that my breath caught in my throat. "Old man," the voice rasped from her tiny mouth, "you stink of dust and doubt." Father Devon didn't flinch. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze unwavering. "And you," he said quietly, "are a guest who has overstayed your welcome." A smile stretched Cora's lips, a cruel, adult expression that was a hideous mask on her face. "This flesh is my house. I built it. I am the foundation and the roof." That night, Father Devon explained it to me. He used words I had only ever seen in movies, words that felt like stones in the quiet of my kitchen. Infestation, oppression, datum, possession. He told me the church had a rite, a ritual of exorcism, but it was not a magic spell. It was a battle, a brutal, spiritual war fought over the ground of my daughter's soul. He was frank about the dangers. The entity could kill her, could use her body to kill us, could simply refuse to leave and leave her a hollowed-out shell. His faith was not the blazing sun of a zealot, but the slow, deep-burning ember of a man who has seen the darkness, and has, by some miracle, not been entirely consumed by it. He had doubts, he admitted, but he had a duty. We prepared for 3 days. We moved Cora to the center room of the house, a small, windowless den, and we stripped it bare. We removed everything but a single plain cot. Father Devon blessed the room, his voice a steady murmur as he traced crosses on the walls with oil that smelled of chrism and antiquity. He enlisted Father Colby to return to assist him. The younger priest was pale and trembling, but he came. He could not meet my eyes. The wind outside did not cease. It became the soundtrack to our grim preparations, a constant, moaning chorus. On the 4th day, we began. We bound Cora to the cot with soft leather straps. She did not fight us. She lay placidly, watching us with those cold, knowing eyes, a faint smile playing on her lips. The 2 priests, clad in simple white surplices over their black cassocks, stood on either side of her. I stood by the door, a vessel of pure terror, my knuckles white as I gripped the frame. Father Devon began to pray. His voice was low and firm, the Latin words rolling out with a practiced rhythm. The Ritual Romanum. It was not a shout, but a declaration. At first, nothing happened. The only sound was the wind and the steady metronomic prayer. Then, Cora's head tilted back on the cot. Her body went rigid. The smile vanished, replaced by a snarl of pure hatred. "Silence, you old fool!" the voice snarled, thick and phlegmy. Father Devon did not pause. He pressed on, his voice gaining a fraction of volume. Father Colby joined in, his voice thinner, higher, laced with a fear he could not conceal. Cora's body began to twist on the cot. It was not the thrashing of a child having a fit. It was a series of contortions, poses of impossible anatomy, her spine arching until only her head and heels touched the mattress, her joints bending in directions that spoke of broken bones, though none were broken. The air in the room grew thick and cold. The metallic smell intensified, mixed now with the stench of something rotten, something that had been buried deep. "I know your name, priest," the voice hissed. "Devon. I have tasted the doubt in your heart like sour wine. You think your empty words can evict me. This one called me. She was lonely. She was a hollow thing, and I filled her. Lies are your only weapon," Devon intoned, his prayers never faltering. "You have no power here but what we give you through fear." The entity laughed, a sound like grinding gravel. It spoke then, not to the priests, but to me. Its head swiveled, the neck cracking audibly, and its eyes, Cora's eyes, locked with mine. "Beverly! Mother! You were never enough for her, were you? She cried for a father who fled. She cried for a mother who was always tired, always busy. You left the door open. You left her empty. I am the only one who never leaves." The words were a physical blow. They found every secret fear, every late-night guilt, and gave them a voice. I felt my legs buckle. I sank to my knees, a sob tearing from my throat. "Do not listen, Beverly." Father Devon's voice cut through my despair, sharp as a blade. "It is the father of lies. It feeds on your pain. Deny it." The battle raged for hours. It was a monotonous, ritualistic horror. The prayers would rise. The entity would retaliate with obscenities and revelations designed to shatter us. It spoke of Colby's secret shame, a childhood sin he had confessed only in the sealed darkness of the confessional. And the young priest wept, his prayers becoming a broken whisper. It showed us things. The walls seemed to sweat a dark, viscous fluid. Shadows detached themselves from the corners and crawled like insects across the ceiling. The temperature swung from Arctic cold to a stifling, feverish heat. My Cora was in there somewhere. In a moment of relative calm, her body went limp, and her own voice, small and terrified, whispered, "Mommy, it's so dark in here. It's singing to me." Then the entity would reclaim her, its face a mask of fury, and the struggle would begin anew. The climax came as the wind outside reached a fever pitch, howling around the house like a pack of wolves. Father Devon, his face gray with exhaustion, held up a simple silver crucifix. He pressed it against Cora's forehead. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you, unclean spirit, to depart from this creature of God." A scream erupted from Cora's mouth, a sound of such pure, undiluted agony and rage that it seemed to tear the very air. The walls of the room bulged inward. The single bare light bulb above us exploded in a shower of glass. In the sudden darkness I saw a shape, a coalescence of the crawling shadows and the foul air, a thing of jagged angles and a profound, mind-breaking wrongness. Tear itself free from my daughter's butt. It was there for only a second, a stain upon reality, and then it was gone. The wind stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a silence so deep it felt like the world had been reset. Cora lay on the cot, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps. She was herself. The cold, ancient look was gone from her eyes, replaced by a child's exhausted confusion. She was just a little girl, pale and trembling, the leather straps lying loose around her thin wrists. Father Colby was curled in a fetal position on the floor, muttering the Lord's Prayer over and over. Father Devon slumped against the wall, his chest heaving, the crucifix still clutched in his hand. He looked 1,000 years old. We untied Cora. I gathered her into my arms, weeping, feeling the warmth of her, the simple, human weight of her. She clung to me, burying her face in my neck. "The bad song is gone, Mommy," she whispered, and then fell into a deep, natural sleep. We cleaned the room. We opened the door to let in the fresh, still air. The world outside was calm. The copper beech stood motionless, its branches serene against a sky now clearing to a soft twilight. We had won. Weeks passed. Cora recovered with the resilience of the young. The color returned to her cheeks. She began to laugh again, a sound more precious to me than any music. She drew pictures of suns and flowers. She never spoke of the time of the bad song. We moved out of the old Victorian. I couldn't bear the memory of its rooms, the sight of that beech tree. We found a small, modern apartment on the other side of town, filled with light. I thought it was over. I thought we had escaped. Then, this morning, I was making pancakes. Cora was at the small kitchen table, coloring. The radio was playing a soft, instrumental piece. I hummed along, flipping a pancake, feeling a peace I had not known in years. I turned to put a plate on the table and saw that Cora had stopped coloring. She was staring at the blank white wall, her head cocked to one side, as if listening to a distant sound. A faint, familiar smell touched my nostrils. The smell of old pennies and damp soil. Cora turned her head and looked at me, and she smiled. It was not her smile. It was the same cruel, adult mask I had seen on the cot in that terrible room. "The song," she said, her voice a perfect, childish treble, yet underpinned by that same guttural rasp I knew so well. "It's not gone. It was just waiting. It learned a new verse." She held up her coloring book. She had not been drawing suns or flowers. With a black crayon, she had covered the entire page in a dense, intricate, and horrifyingly familiar pattern. A pattern that I had last seen crawling across the ceiling of that windowless room. My blood turned to ice. The spatula clattered from my numb fingers. I looked from the drawing to her face, to the knowing, ancient darkness in her eyes, and I understood. We had not won a battle. We had merely driven the enemy to a different part of the field. It had not been exercised. It had gone to ground. It had been waiting. It had learned the most devastating weapon of all, how to be patient. And outside, though we were 3 stories up and miles from the old house, I heard it, faint but unmistakable, a low thrumming in the air, a sound like whispering teeth. The sound was inside the apartment. It wasn't the wind against a tree, but a vibration in the very air, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I stood frozen, my gaze locked with my daughter's. The pancake on the stove began to smoke, filling the small, sunlit kitchen with the acrid smell of burning batter, but neither of us moved. The normalcy of the moment lay shattered at our feet. Cora's smile did not waver. It was a fixed, terrible thing. She slowly closed the coloring book, her small fingers patting the cover with a finality that made my stomach clench. I had to do something. I had to move. My body felt like stone. I forced a breath, then another, my mind screaming for a plan, for a prayer, for anything. I took a step towards her, my hand outstretched, a mother's instinct to comfort, even when the thing before her was not her child. "Cora," I whispered, my voice cracking. Her head tilted, a gesture of cold appraisal. "She's resting," the voice replied, a chilling harmony of her sweet tone and that other, deeper one. "She is safe with me, safer than she was with you." I lunged for the phone on the counter, my fingers, clumsy and numb, scrambled to dial Father Devon's number. I put the phone to my ear, my eyes never leaving Cora. She watched me, her expression one of mild, amused curiosity, as if I were an ant performing a particularly futile trick. The line rang once, then connected. There was a burst of static, and then a sound came through the earpiece that was not a ring, not a voice, but the same low, wet clicking I had heard from her room all those months ago. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. It clattered to the tile, the clicking sound continuing for a moment before the line went dead. Cora laughed, a light, tinkling sound that was utterly devoid of joy. "He is old," she said. "His faith is a leaky boat. He cannot help you now." I backed away until I hit the kitchen counter, my hands gripping the cold laminate. There was no holy water here, no crucifixes, no priests. There was just me, in a kitchen that smelled of smoke and decay, facing the thing that wore my daughter's skin. "What do you want?" I begged, the question torn from the deepest, most desolate part of me. She slid off her chair and took a step towards me. I told you. This is my house. I am the foundation and the roof you tried to remodel. It was inconvenient. Now I am making improvements." She gestured vaguely around the apartment. "This place is temporary. We will be going back to the other house soon. The tree misses us." The thought of returning to that old Victorian, to the whispering beach and the memory-laden shadows, was a fresh wave of nausea. "No," I said, the word a feeble protest. "Yes," she said, and her voice was suddenly hard, the childish veneer melting away to reveal the iron core beneath. "You will take us back. You will open the doors. You are the key, Beverly. You always were." She took another step, and I saw her shadow on the floor. It was wrong. It did not match her form. It was taller, thinner, a spindly thing with too many joints, and its head was cocked at the same listening angle hers had been moments before. I had no weapons, no rituals, no hope. All I had was the raw, animal love of a mother for her child. I pushed myself away from the counter, my fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of defiant rage. "You will not have her," I snarled, and I rushed forward not to strike, but to gather her into my arms, to hold the real Cora against me, to somehow squeeze the invader out through the sheer force of my love. My arms closed around her small, stiff body. The moment I touched her, a jolt of freezing cold shot up my arms. The metallic, earthy smell filled my nostrils, suffocating. She did not struggle. She simply stood there, letting me hold her. Then her head turned, her mouth close to my ear. "Silly mother," the voice whispered, intimate and vile. "You are holding me." I recoiled, stumbling back, my arms feeling contaminated. She smiled that terrible smile again, then turned and walked calmly to the small living room. She sat on the sofa, picked up the television remote and clicked it on. A cartoon filled the screen, bright colors and cheerful music. She began to watch, her posture perfectly that of a normal 7-year-old. I stood in the doorway, shaking, watching this grotesque pantomime of domesticity. The cartoon music seemed to warp at the edges, the cheerful melodies twisting into a dissonant, minor-key version of themselves, a sound that harmonized perfectly with the low thrum still vibrating through the apartment. The battle was not over. It had just changed venues. And this time, I was utterly alone. The day stretched into a nightmare of normalcy. Cora, or the thing that was Cora, sat through her cartoons. She asked for apple juice in a perfectly even tone. She did not look at me again, but I felt its awareness like a pressure on the back of my neck. I moved through the apartment in a daze, cleaning the burnt pancake from the pan, wiping the counter, my actions robotic and meaningless. Every sound from the living room made me flinch. The cheerful, distorted music from the television was a constant torture. I needed a plan. Father Devon was my first and only thought, but the phone was dead. I picked it up again, listening to the empty, hollow silence on the line. I found my cell phone in my purse. The screen was blank. I pressed the power button. Nothing. It was fully charged last night, but now it was as inert as a stone. I understood. It was isolating us, cutting us off. I had to get out. I had to get to a neighbor, to a payphone, to anything. I edged towards the apartment door, my heart hammering against my ribs. My hand closed around the cool metal of the doorknob. I turned it. The lock clicked open. A surge of desperate hope flooded me. I pulled. The door did not budge. It wasn't locked. It was simply shut, as if welded into the frame. I pulled again, putting my whole weight into it. The door didn't even shudder. It was as immovable as a mountain. I looked through the peephole. The hallway outside was dark, not just unlit, but a profound, absolute blackness that swallowed the light from the other apartments. A small sound came from behind me. I turned. Cora was standing in the doorway to the living room, holding her empty juice cup. "More, please," she said. Her eyes were flat, like painted stones. I took the cup from her, my hand trembling. As I turned to the refrigerator, I felt a sudden, intense cold spot in the middle of the kitchen. The air shimmered, like heat rising from asphalt. And for a split second, I saw it again. The suggestion of that jagged, unnatural shape from the den. A stain on the air itself. Then it was gone, leaving only the cold and the smell. It was demonstrating its power. It was showing me that the rules of this world no longer applied. The apartment was no longer a sanctuary. It was a cage. I poured the juice and gave it to her. She took it without a word and went back to the sofa. I leaned against the refrigerator, the cold metal seeping through my shirt. My mind raced, scrabbling for purchase. The rituals, the prayers, the holy water. They had worked before, but only in a specific consecrated space, with 2 ordained priests. I had none of that. I had only the memory of the words. I began to whisper the Lord's Prayer. "Our Father, who art in heaven." From the living room, the volume on the television spiked, the warped cartoon music drowning out my words. I pressed my hands over my ears and tried again, speaking the words inside my own head. A sharp, stabbing pain bloomed behind my eyes. I cried out, stumbling against the counter. Cora appeared in the doorway. "Stop that," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's rude to whisper." The rest of the afternoon was a silent standoff. I sat at the kitchen table, and she sat on the sofa. The television her shield and her throne. The light outside the windows began to fade, the cheerful yellow of day giving way to the deep blue of twilight. Normally I would be turning on lamps, filling the apartment with a warm, artificial glow. I was afraid to move. As the last of the natural light vanished, the apartment did not go completely dark. A faint, sickly greenish luminescence began to emanate from the walls themselves, casting long, distorted shadows. The thrumming in the air grew louder, resolving into a multitude of whispers, too low to understand, a cacophony of secrets and lies. Cora stood up and turned off the television. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise. "It's time to go to bed," she announced. She wasn't asking. "It's early, sweetheart," I said, the endearment ash in my mouth. "We have a long drive tomorrow," she replied, and the look in her eyes was ancient and absolute. "Back to our real home." She walked past me and down the short hall to her bedroom. She did not look back. I heard the door click shut. I was alone in the glowing, whispering kitchen. I knew then that this was not a negotiation. It was a relocation. It was taking us back to the source of its power, to the house and the beech tree. And I was the vehicle. I had no choice. To refuse would be to watch it twist and break her little body right in front of me. My love was not a weapon. It was a chain. It was leading me and my daughter right back into the heart of the darkness. I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table as the green glow pulsed softly, the whispers a constant, maddening hiss just below the threshold of comprehension. I thought of the drive. I thought of the old house, standing empty and waiting. I thought of the copper beech, its branches like grasping fingers. I could not go back, but I could not stay here. As the first gray light of dawn began to dilute the unnatural luminescence in the apartment, a plan formed in my mind. It was a desperate, foolish plan, but it was the only one I had. I would play along. I would take us back to the Victorian, but I would not go inside. I would get her to the threshold, and then I would run. I would take Cora, and I would run until my legs gave out. We would disappear. We would find some remote place, some forgotten corner of the world where it could not find us. The bedroom door opened. Cora emerged, already dressed in the clothes she had worn the day before. Her hair was neat. She looked well-rested and eerily composed. "Car is packed," she said, her voice flat. I hadn't packed anything. I looked past her, into her bedroom. The small suitcase she used for sleepovers was by her bed, closed and ready. I had not put it there. I stood up, my joints stiff and aching. "Okay," I whispered. The word felt like a betrayal. I walked to the apartment door, expecting to find it still sealed shut. I reached for the knob, my hand shaking. To my surprise, it turned easily. The door swung inward, revealing the perfectly normal, sunlit hallway of our apartment building. The illusion of normality was so complete it was disorienting. We walked out. I half expected the door to slam shut and lock behind us, but it didn't. We took the elevator down to the parking garage in silence. Our car was there, right where I had left it. But on the passenger seat was my purse, and beside it, the car keys. I had left them upstairs. I got in, my skin crawling. I started the engine. The radio blared to life, tuned to a station of pure, screeching static. I fumbled and turned it off. The silence in the car was heavy and expectant. Cora sat in the back seat, strapped into her booster seat. She stared out the window, her expression unreadable. I drove. The morning traffic was light. The sun was bright. People were walking their dogs, going to work, living their lives. It was all so ordinary, a stark contrast to the horror movie playing out inside my car. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see that cruel smile, but she just watched the world go by. We were on the outskirts of town, nearing the old neighborhood, when she spoke. "You are thinking of running," she said, her voice conversational. "You think you can take her from me at the door. You think you are faster." My blood ran cold. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "It is a pointless thought," she continued. "She is not a separate thing you can carry away. I am in the marrow of her bones. I am the rhythm of her heart. If you run, I run with you. There is no her without me anymore. We are becoming one." Tears blurred my vision. I swiped at them angrily. "You're a liar." "Am I?" she asked. "Then why are you driving us home, Beverly? If you truly believed you could save her, you would have driven this car into a tree miles ago. You have not, because a part of you knows I am telling the truth. A part of you knows she is already mine." The truth of her words was a poison that spread through my veins. She was right. I had considered it, the violent, final option, and I had rejected it, because I was afraid it was already too late. The familiar streets rolled by, the large old houses with their wide porches and sprawling lawns, And then, there it was. The Victorian. It looked worse than I remembered. Peeling paint, a sagging gutter, the lawn overgrown and choked with weeds. It looked sick. The copper beech dominated the yard, its leaves a dull bruised purple in the morning light. It seemed larger, its shadow stretching across the entire front of the house, a pool of perpetual twilight. I pulled into the driveway and put the car in park. My body was rigid with dread. I could not make myself open the door. Cora unclipped her own seatbelt. She opened her door and got out. She stood on the cracked pavement and looked up at the house, a faint possessive smile on her lips. She then turned and looked at me through the windshield. Her voice, when it came, was clear and carried an impossible weight of command. It was the voice that had shaken the walls of the den. "Come, Mother," it said. "It is time to come inside." I turned off the engine. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. My hand was still on the key, frozen in place. I looked at the house, then at my daughter, who was no longer my daughter. The front door of the Victorian was already open, a black rectangle promising nothing but an end. I had to get out of the car. My legs felt like water. I pushed the door open and my feet hit the driveway. The air here was different. It was still and thick, and the smell, that metallic, earthy smell, was so strong it was a taste at the back of my throat. The beech tree seemed to watch me, its leaves rustling though there was no wind. Cora was already walking toward the open door. She didn't look back. She knew I would follow. My love for her, the real her, was the leash it held. I took a step, then another, my shoes crunching on the gravel. Each step was a surrender. I was crossing a line from which I knew there was no return. The shadow of the house fell over me and the temperature dropped sharply. I could hear it now, not just a whisper, but a chorus, a multitude of voices murmuring from inside the house, from the very ground beneath my feet. She paused on the porch, one small hand resting on the doorframe. She looked back at me, her eyes pits of patient darkness. "Hurry," she said, and her voice was the creak of an old branch. "The others are waiting." Others. The word sent a new jolt of terror through me. I thought of the previous owners, the rumors, the shadows that had moved in the corners of my vision during our first stay here. I reached the bottom of the porch steps. The top step was a threshold I had sworn I would never cross again. Cora smiled, a slow, spreading crack in the facade of her face. "Welcome home," she said. And from deep within the house, from the darkness of the den where it had all begun, a new sound answered. It was not a whisper or a click. It was a slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floorboards. It was the sound of something coming to greet its new family. My feet carried me up the steps, toward my daughter, toward the open door, toward the waiting dark. I was not driving the enemy out. I was delivering myself to it. The key was turning in the lock, and on the other side was forever. The dragging sound stopped just beyond the doorway, hidden in the foyer's gloom. Cora extended her hand, not to take mine, but to usher me inside. Her gesture was that of a gracious host, and the sheer wrongness of it broke the last of my resistance. I crossed the threshold. The door slammed shut behind me with a finality that shook the house. The little light that filtered through the grimy windows did nothing to dispel the darkness. It merely tinted it a murky gray. The air was frigid and heavy with dust, and that other, older scent. The whispers were no longer a background hum. They were distinct, layered voices, speaking over one another in a language I felt in my teeth. Cora walked ahead of me, her footsteps silent on the filthy runner. She turned left, toward the archway that led to the den. I followed, my own steps heavy, my body moving as if through deep water. I could feel them watching from the shadows of the parlor, from the top of the stairs. Unseen presences shifting in the periphery. The den was exactly as we had left it months ago. The furniture was still pushed against the walls, the floor bare. In the center of the room, the floorboards were stained a deep, dark brown, almost black. The air above the stain shimmered with a heatless, wavering energy. Cora stood beside the stain and looked at me. "This is the heart," she said. "The root. You tried to seal it, a foolish thing to do. It only made it hungry." The dragging sound started again, closer now. It came from the corner of the room where the shadows were thickest. A shape began to detach itself from the darkness. It was tall and spindly, a thing of angles and sharp edges, moving with a lurching, unnatural gait. It had no face, only a suggestion of one, a hollow where a face should be. It was the source of the clicking, the whispers, the cold. It was the thing from the earpiece, the thing in the shadow, the true tenant of this house. Cora did not flinch. She looked upon it with a kind of reverence. "It is time to finish the remodeling," she said, her voice no longer her own, but a perfect echo of the thing's dry, rustling tone. "Time for you to join the foundation." The thing took a lurching step toward me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. My love for Cora had brought me here, but it was a paralyzing fear that held me now. The thing raised a long, thin limb, not to strike, but to point at the dark stain on the floor. Cora smiled. "Lie down, Mother." The command was absolute. My body obeyed before my mind could protest. I sank to my knees, then lay down on the cold, rough wood, my head resting on the edge of the stain. The moment my body made contact, a deep, resonant hum vibrated up through the floorboards, into my bones. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swarming inside my head. I turned my head. Cora was kneeling beside me, her small hands stroking my hair with a chilling imitation of comfort. "Don't fight," she whispered, her breath cold against my ear. "It will be easier. You will be part of the house. You will always be with me." The spindly thing loomed over us, its hollow face regarding me. The dragging sound was its movement, the sound of its form scraping against our world. It reached down, and its touch was like ice and static. I felt a pulling, not on my body, but on myself. A draining sensation, as if my memories, my fears, my very essence were being siphoned out. I closed my eyes, the last of my will dissolving into the chorus of whispers. I was not being killed. I was being incorporated. I was becoming part of the house, another voice in its walls, another shadow in its corners. The last thing I felt was Cora's hand, small and cold, holding mine as the darkness took me completely. The darkness was not empty. It was a crowded, humming void. I was no longer Beverly, not entirely. I was a collection of sensations, of memories, playing on a loop. I could feel the rough grain of the floorboards, the chill of the air, but they were not against my skin. They were me. The house was me. I was the dust motes dancing in a sliver of light, the groan of a pipe in the walls, the persistent whisper that now had my voice mixed in with the others. I could see, but not with eyes. My awareness was a net cast over the house. I saw Cora standing in the center of the den, looking down at the empty space where my body had been. There was no grief on her face, only a quiet satisfaction. The spindly thing was gone, having retreated back into the deeper shadows from which it came, its purpose fulfilled. Cora turned and walked out of the den, her footsteps echoing in the foyer. She climbed the stairs, each step firm and certain. I was with her, in the creak of the wood beneath her feet, in the still air that parted for her. She went to her old room, the one with the faded floral wallpaper. She did not turn on a light. She walked to the window and looked out at the copper beach. Its branches now seemed to reach for the glass, as if in recognition. From my new, diffused perspective, I could feel the tree. Its roots were a tangled, pulsing web deep in the earth, intertwined with the foundation of the house. They were not separate. The tree and the house and the thing were all one entity, and now I was part of it too. My consciousness was a new thread woven into a vast, ancient tapestry of suffering. Cora spoke, her voice soft but clear in the silent room. She is settled. She was not speaking to me, or to herself. She was reporting. A presence stirred in the corner of the room, a coalescence of shadow and cold. The clicking sound began, soft and rhythmic. It was a language, and I understood it now. It was a language of ownership, of hunger, of slow, patient conquest. It was pleased. I tried to scream, to rebel, but I had no mouth. My protest was a sudden draft that rustled the curtains, a brief spike of cold that made Cora shiver. She glanced around, a flicker of annoyance on her face. "Be still," she said, and the command was like a lock sliding into place. My awareness was forced down, compressed from the whole house to the confines of the den, to the dark stain on the floor. I was trapped within the heart of it, a prisoner in the walls of my own tomb. Time lost its meaning. I drifted in a sea of other voices, other souls who had been consumed. A man who had built the house, a woman who had planted the tree, others who had come after. Their identities were eroded, their memories just echoes. I fought against the erosion, clinging to the image of Cora's face, to the memory of her laugh before all of this. It was my anchor. Then a new sensation, a vibration, a car door slamming outside. My consciousness surged, flowing through the house's structure toward the front. A car was parked in the driveway, a familiar, battered sedan. Father Devon was getting out, his face set in a grim line. He was holding a small wooden box. He had found my note, the one I had scribbled in a moment of desperate clarity and mailed days ago, just before the phones died. I had written only 2 words, the Victorian. He had come. Hope, a feeling I thought had been extinguished, flared within my confined essence. He walked toward the porch, his step determined, but I could feel the oppressive weight of the house pushing against him. He hesitated at the bottom of the steps, his hand going to the cross around his neck. He couldn't come in. I knew it with a certainty that was part of the house knowledge. The threshold was sealed to anything that meant it harm. He was a threat. The house would not allow it, but I could. I focused every shred of my will, every memory of light and love I had left. I was not just a ghost. I was part of the house's fabric. I pushed against the invisible barrier at the door, against the will of the thing that owned me. It was like pushing against a mountain. The other voices in the stain murmured in alarm, their fear feeding the resistance. Father Devon took a step up, then another. He was on the porch. He reached for the doorbell, but his finger never touched it. The front door swung open on its own. Cora stood there, smiling her placid, empty smile. "Hello, Father," she said. "We've been waiting for you." Story 2. The first thing I noticed about the girl was the way she touched the fence post. It was not a casual gesture. Her fingers, pale and slender, would extend, almost trembling, and trace the exact same path down the weathered wood, from the splintered top to the rusted nail head 6 inches down. Then her hand would fall to her side. A pause, long enough to draw a single, shallow breath. And then the hand would rise again. The fingers would extend, and they would trace the path from the splintered top to the rusted nail head. Down, pause. Down, pause. Down. It was a loop, a silent, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to pull the very air around her into its pattern, making the afternoon light thick and syrupy. I watched from my kitchen window, my own hand frozen around the cool porcelain of a coffee mug, and I felt the world narrow to that single, repeating motion. This is my home. I need you to understand that. After the long night of chains and fire, after the river and the dogs and the kind-eyed Quaker woman who smelled of lavender and lye soap, I built this. Me, Joan, with these hands. The house is not grand, but its timbers are straight, and its roof is sound. The land is not vast, but it yields beans and squash, and a few stubborn potatoes. It holds Damon's laughter in its walls, and Carla's dreams in its quiet corners. It is a fortress of normality, a careful, deliberate construction against the memory of what came before. I built it to keep the past out, but watching that girl, with her ceaseless, mechanical gesture, I knew, with a cold certainty that settled in the marrow of my bones, that the past was not something outside to be kept at bay. It was a seed, buried deep, and it was now beginning to split open in the dark, fertile soil of my present. Her name was Liz. She told us that the first evening when Damon, with his boundless and often misplaced compassion, invited her in from the creeping dusk. She stood on the braided rug just inside the doorway, as if standing on the deck of a ship, and said, "Liz," in a voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. She was maybe 17, 18, her face a pale oval framed by hair the color of dust. Her eyes were the most unsettling thing, not for their color, which was a simple, plain brown, but for their stillness. They did not dart, or search, or hold a light of their own. They simply were, like the eyes of a creature that lives deep underground. Carla, my bright, pragmatic daughter of 15 years, was wary. She stood half behind me, her shoulder pressing into my arm, a solid, warm weight. "Where's your family?" she asked, her voice too loud in the quiet room. Liz's gaze drifted past us, to the crackling fire in the hearth. "Gone," she said, and the word had no echo, no resonance. It was a flat, final fact. Damon, my rock, my harbor, put a hand on my lower back, a gesture meant to be reassuring. His touch was usually a balm, but tonight it felt like a brand. "You can stay in the old storage room off the kitchen," he said. "Just for a night or two. Get your bearings." I did not protest. To protest would be to give voice to the dread that was coiling in my gut, to acknowledge the ghost that had just walked in human form over my threshold. So I nodded, and I forced a smile that felt like a crack in clay, and I watched as Liz followed Damon to the little room, her feet making no sound on the floorboards. That night, the dreams returned. I had not had them in years, not since the first months in this house, when the scent of fresh-cut pine could still, for a moment, overpower the phantom stench of sweat and fear. But now they were back, vivid and suffocating. I was running through the cane again, the broad leaves slashing at my arms and face, their edges like razors. The air was thick with the cloying sweetness of crushed stalks and the hot, coppery smell of my own terror. And ahead of me, always just out of sight, was a smaller figure, a shadow within the shadows, its breath coming in ragged, desperate sobs. I would reach out, my fingers brushing against rough cloth, and then I would wake, my own scream trapped in my throat, the taste of dirt and iron on my tongue. I would lie there in the dark, listening to Damon's steady breathing beside me, and feel the weight of the house around us. It felt different now. It felt watched. And sometimes, in the deep silence between the calls of the night birds, I would hear a faint, rhythmic sound, a soft, dry scrape, like fingers tracing a path down a wooden post, over and over again. Liz stayed. The days folded into one another, and she became a part of the household's rhythm, a silent, unsettling note in its melody. She did not work in the fields with Damon, nor did she help Carla with the sewing or the preserves. She simply existed. She would sit for hours on the back porch, her hands in her lap, staring out at the line of trees that marked the edge of our property. She was drawn to edges, to boundaries, the fence line, the tree line, the horizon where the sky met the earth. It was Carla who first noticed the other thing. "She hums," she said to me one afternoon as we shelled peas on the porch. Liz was at her usual post by the fence, her back to us. "It's not a song. It's just a sound. A low note. It makes my teeth ache." I listened. At first I heard nothing but the wind in the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. But then, beneath it all, I caught it. A low, resonant hum, so deep it was almost a vibration in the air, rather than a sound. It was the auditory equivalent of the pressure drop before a storm. It was the sound of a held breath, the sound of waiting. The omens began to accumulate, subtle at first, then undeniable. The community, our small congregation of freedmen and women, and a handful of sympathetic whites who met in the drafty schoolhouse on Sundays, felt it too. Where once I was met with warm smiles and clasped hands, now I saw sidelong glances and conversations that faltered when I approached. Sister Agatha, her face a road map of hardship and faith, took my hands in hers after the service. Her skin was papery and cool. "That girl you took in, Joan," she said, her voice low. "There's a stillness to her that ain't natural, like the calm in the eye of a hurricane. You be careful, you hear. Some storms, they follow a person." I wanted to tell her that the storm was not following the girl. The girl was the storm. Or perhaps she was just the first cold drop of rain. I said nothing, only nodded, the weight of her warning settling on my shoulders like a yoke. At home, the atmosphere curdled. Objects began to appear misplaced. My mother's old wooden hairbrush, the one thing I had managed to carry with me from that other life, was found lying in the middle of the vegetable garden, caked in mud. A pot of stew, left to simmer, was found cold and congealed. A fine layer of the same black dirt from the garden, floating on its surface. The air in the house grew heavy and cold, a chill that clung to the bones and defied the heat of the fire. And through it all, there was Liz. She began to speak more, but her words were not her own. She would echo fragments of conversations we had had hours before, or days, repeating them with perfect, soulless accuracy. She would look at Carla and say, in Carla's own voice, "The thread is too coarse for this fabric," a complaint Carla had muttered under her breath just that morning. She would look at Damon and say, in a flat monotone that was an exact imitation of me, "The north field needs tending before the rain comes." It was a violation, this theft of our voices, our private moments. It made a mockery of our lives, turning our home into a stage where a phantom performed a distorted version of our existence. The climax did not arrive with a bang, but with a slow, dreadful unraveling. It was Carla who broke first. My strong, resilient girl, who had never known the whip or the brand, began to fray at the edges. She stopped eating. She would jump at the slightest sound. Her eyes, once so bright and full of plans, became hollow and shadowed. "She talks to someone at night," Carla whispered to me, her body trembling as I held her in the dark of her room. "In her room, she has conversations. But Mama, she uses both voices." That was the final thread. I could no longer pretend. I could no longer hide behind the fragile walls of my new life. The past was not knocking at the door. It was already inside, sitting at our table, sleeping in our house, wearing the face of a pale, silent girl. I went to the storage room. I did not Knock. I pushed the door open and stood there, the lamplight throwing my long, wavering shadow across the floor. Liz was sitting on the edge of the narrow cot, her hands folded in her lap. She was not humming. The room was preternaturally silent, the air so still it felt solid. "Who are you?" I asked, and my voice was a ragged thing, torn from a place deep inside me I had tried to bury. She looked up at me, and for the first time, her eyes held a light. It was not a warm light. It was the cold, phosphorescent glow of rot, of things long dead and forgotten. "You know," she said, and her voice was different. It was younger, thinner, laced with a terror I remembered as intimately as my own heartbeat. It was Liza's voice, my little sister's voice. The world tilted. The walls of the room seemed to dissolve, and I was back in the cane, the night we ran. I had her small, trusting hand in mine. We were almost to the river, almost to freedom, and then the shout, the baying of the dogs, so close. And the choice, the unbearable, unforgivable choice. Her small, terrified face looking up at me in the moonlight. My own voice, harsh and desperate. "Stay here. Stay quiet. I will come back for you. I promise." I let go of her hand. I ran, and I never went back. I had built this life, this house, this family, on the foundation of that single, unspeakable act. I had buried the memory of my sister's name, of her face, of the feel of her small, cold fingers slipping from mine. I had told myself I had no choice. I had told myself it was the only way. I had carved a life out of that guilt, a monument to my own survival. Liz stood up. She was not Liz anymore. She was my sin, my ghost, my debt come due. She was the embodiment of the promise I broke, the trust I shattered. She took a step toward me, and the hum returned. But now it was not a single note. It was a chorus of whispers, of weeping, of the wind through the cane and the baying of the hounds and the frantic fading beat of a child's heart. "You left a piece of yourself behind," she said. And now her voice was a composite of all the voices of my past, a swirling vortex of memory and accusation. "You thought you could outrun it, but you can't. I am that piece. I am the silence where your promise died." She reached out, not to touch me, but to point past me, toward the small clouded mirror hanging on the wall beside the door. "Look." I did not want to look. I wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this waking nightmare. But I was rooted to the spot, held by a force greater than my own will. I turned my head. The mirror did not show my reflection. It showed a scene from that long-ago night. It showed a patch of dense cane, moonlit and trembling. And there, huddled in the roots of a great ancient tree, was a small figure. It was me. Not the girl I had been, but me as I was now. Joan, the mother, the homesteader, the woman who had built a life on a lie. I was crouched there, in the memory, my eyes wide with a terror that was not just fear, but a profound, soul-crushing understanding. I was not watching my past. I was the one hiding in the cane. I was the one who had been left behind. The revelation was absolute, an ice-water truth that flooded my veins. There was no Liz. There was no ghost of Liza returned. This was not a haunting from without, but a collapse from within. The generational trauma was not a chain I had broken. It was a loop I was trapped in. I was both the woman who ran and the child who was abandoned. I had spent my whole life running from the part of myself I left in that field, and in doing so, I had given it form. I had given it power. I had invited it into my home and called it a stranger. The girl behind me was gone. The room was empty. The hum had ceased. From the main part of the house, I could hear the familiar, comforting sounds of Damon banking the fire and Carla moving about, preparing for bed. A world of normality, just steps away. I looked back into the mirror. The scene that came was gone. Now it showed only my own reflection. My face was pale. My eyes were haunted, but they were my own. I saw the lines of hardship and the scars of survival. I saw the woman I had fought so hard to become, and I saw that the reflection was not moving. The real me was breathing. My heart was pounding. A tremor was in my hands. But the Joan in the mirror was perfectly, utterly still. Her eyes held no reaction, no terror, no grief. They held only a deep, infinite, and knowing stillness. She was the part of me that never left that field. She was the silence at the core of my being. She was the promise I broke, forever waiting, forever watching. I stood there for a long time, the sounds of my family, a distant murmur from another life. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply watched the still woman in the glass, and she watched me. And in that perfect, silent understanding, there was no need for anything else at all. I do not know how long I stood there, locked in that silent communion with the stillness in the mirror. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had lost its shape, its forward momentum. It was a pool, and I was at its bottom, looking up at the distorted surface of my own life. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. The sound was like a crack in a frozen lake. I blinked and the spell was broken. The reflection in the mirror was my own again, my chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, my eyes wide with a horror too profound for tears. I turned away, my body moving stiffly, as if it were learning its functions all over again. Damon was standing in the doorway of our bedroom, his large frame silhouetted by the low lamplight behind him. "Joan?" he said, his voice thick with sleep and concern. "What are you doing up?" I heard a noise. I looked at him, at this good man whose love I had built my fortress around. I saw the lines of worry on his face, the genuine confusion in his eyes. He saw a wife who had been troubled by bad dreams. He did not see the woman who had just faced the foundational lie of her own soul. How could I explain it? The words did not exist in any language we shared. It was nothing, I heard myself say. The voice that came out was mine, but it felt thin. A borrowed coat. A bad dream. I just needed a glass of water. He nodded, accepting the fiction because it was the only one available to him. "Come back to bed. You're shivering." And lead me back to our room. His arm around my shoulders, a solid, warm weight that felt both alien and desperately needed. I lay down beside him, listening to his breathing even out, and returned to the rhythm of sleep. I stared into the darkness, and the darkness stared back. The house was quiet now. The hum was gone. The scraping was gone. Liz was gone. But the presence was heavier than ever, because it was no longer out there. It was in here. It was me. The next morning, the sun rose, as it always did. The rooster crowed. The smell of coffee and wood smoke filled the air. Carla came into the kitchen, her eyes still puffy from a restless sleep. She looked at the empty space at the table where Liz usually sat, a silent, unsettling fixture. "Where is she?" Carla asked, her voice cautious. I was at the stove, stirring the porridge. My hand was steady. My face, I hoped, was calm. "She's gone," I said. Damon looked up from his ledger. "Gone? Where did she go?" "I don't know," I answered, and it was the truth. She must have moved on in the night. A palpable wave of relief washed through the kitchen. Carla's shoulders relaxed. Damon let out a soft sigh. "Strange girl," he murmured, and went back to his accounts. The incident was closed for them. A peculiar, unsettling chapter had ended. The book could be shut. But for me, the book had been blown open, its pages scattered to the wind. I went through the motions of the day. I weeded the garden. I mended a shirt. I spoke to my family with a careful, measured tone. But every action felt like a performance. I was an actor on a stage, playing the part of Joan, while the real Joan was still standing in that storage room, watching the still woman in the mirror. In the afternoon, I found myself walking to the fence post, the one where I had first seen Liz. I reached out, my own fingers, calloused and strong from years of work, tracing the path from the splintered top to the rusted nail head. The gesture was no longer hers. It was mine. It was a ritual of remembrance, a physical acknowledgement of the loop I was in. Down. Pause. Down, then. I looked out at my land, at the house I had built, at the life I had carved from wilderness and will. It was all still there, solid and real. But I saw it now, through a new lens. A double exposure. I saw the homestead, and I saw the cane field. I heard the wind in the pines, and I heard the baying of the hounds. I felt the sun on my skin, and I felt the grip of a small, trusting hand letting go. I had spent a lifetime running from the child in the cane, thinking I could leave her behind. But she was not a separate person. She was the root of me. Her terror was my terror. Her abandonment was the void I had been trying to fill with beans and squash and straight timbers. I had not escaped my past. I had merely been living in its long, cold shadow. That evening I sat with Carla on the porch as she worked on her embroidery. She was quieter than usual, the ordeal with Liz having left its mark. "Mama," she said after a long silence, her needle pausing, "do you ever feel like you're waiting for something, but you don't know what it is?" I looked at my daughter, at the young woman she was becoming, so full of her own future, her own potential for joy and pain. I thought of the generational loop, the silent inheritance of trauma. I would not let my ghost become hers. "Yes, my love," I said, my voice soft but clear. I think I know that feeling. Does it ever go away?" I watched the fireflies begin to blink in the gathering dusk, tiny points of light against the deep blue. I thought of the stillness in the mirror, the part of me that was forever waiting in the cane. I could not destroy it. I could not outrun it. But perhaps, just perhaps, I could learn to sit with it, to acknowledge its presence without letting it consume the light. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "But we don't have to face it alone." I reached out and took her hand, a simple, solid connection in the twilight. And for the first time since Liz had appeared, the air did not feel like a held breath. It felt like a shared silence. It felt, for a single, fragile moment, like the beginning of a different kind of peace. The days that followed were not easy, but they were different. The oppressive dread had lifted, replaced by a kind of solemn clarity. I stopped jumping at shadows because I understood now that the shadow was cast by me. The faint, rhythmic scraping sound did not return. But sometimes, in a moment of quiet, I would catch myself tracing a line on a tabletop or my own knee. That same downward motion, a reminder, a grounding. I began to talk to Carla more, not as a mother shielding her child from a harsh world, but as one who knew that some harshness must be shared to be survived. I told her stories I had never told anyone. Not the full truth, not the unbearable choice, but pieces of it. The fear, the running, the feeling of being utterly, terribly alone. I told her about Liza, my little sister, whose laugh sounded like bells. I spoke her name aloud for the first time in decades, and the air in our home did not curdle. It felt like an offering. Damon noticed the change. He was a man of the earth, not given to lengthy discussions about feelings, but he saw the new light in Carla's eyes. The way the tension had bled from my shoulders, even as a new, deeper sadness had taken residence in my gaze. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, he took my hand, his own grip rough and sure. "You've been carrying a weight, Joan," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I always knew it. I'm glad you're setting it down, even if just a little." I leaned my head against his shoulder, drawing strength from his solid, uncomplicated presence. He did not need to know the specifics of the specter that had visited us. He only needed to know that I was here, with him now. And for the first time, I felt that I truly was. The community's suspicion faded slowly. Without Liz as a focal point, the strange occurrences stopped. The misplaced objects, the cold spots, the dirt in the food, it all ceased. Sister Agatha caught my eye after service one Sunday and gave a slow, knowing nod, as if to say the storm had passed. I nodded back, but I knew the truth. The storm had not passed. I had simply learned to stand in the rain. Weeks turned into a month. The harvest was good, and the cellar was full. The world continued on its axis. One afternoon, I went into the storage room to fetch a jar of pickles. The room was just a room again, smelling of dust and preserves. The narrow cot was empty. The mirror on the wall was just a mirror, showing only the shelves and my own reflection when I passed by it. But I had made a decision. I took the mirror down from the wall. It was heavy, the glass clouded with age around the edges. I carried it outside, past the garden, to the fence line. I did not look into it. I walked to the spot where the old, gnarled oak stood, its branches a sprawling canopy over the boundary between my land and the wild. I dug a hole, not too deep, at the base of the tree. I laid the mirror in the earth, face down, so it would reflect only the dark, rich soil. I covered it over, patting the earth flat. It was not a burial of the past. It was an integration, a recognition that some things are not meant to be stared at every day, but must be acknowledged, must be given a place in the earth from which everything grows. As I stood to leave, a breeze rustled the leaves of the oak, a soft, sighing sound, and for a moment I heard it. Not a hum, not a whisper, not a child's cry. It was just the wind, just the world, and it was enough. I walked back to the house, the soil still under my fingernails. Carla was waiting for me on the porch steps, her expression unreadable. She had been watching me. "You buried it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied, sitting down beside her. She was quiet for a long time, picking at a loose thread on her dress. "The quiet one," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "The one in the mirror. Is she gone?" I looked out at the field, at the freshly turned earth beneath the oak. "No," I said. "She's not gone. But she's where she needs to be now, and so am I." Carla leaned her head against my shoulder, a gesture of trust that felt more profound than any embrace. We sat like that as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The air was cool and clean, and the only sounds were the crickets and the distant lowing of a cow. That night, for the first time in months, I slept. Not a frantic, exhausted collapse, but a true and deep sleep. There were no dreams of cane fields or searching lights. There was only a vast, dark quiet. I woke with the dawn, the memory of the stillness not as a threat, but as a fact. A part of the landscape of my soul, like the bedrock beneath the soil. When I went to the well to draw water, my movements were fluid, unhaunted. I looked at my reflection in the bucket's surface, and it was only my own tired, aging face looking back. The woman in the mirror was at rest. Later, I found Carla in her room. She had a small slate in her lap, and she was drawing. Not the dark, frantic scribbles of before, but a careful, deliberate picture. It was a tree, its roots deep and strong, and beneath its branches stood two figures, a woman and a girl, holding hands. It was simple, but it was whole. "I thought we could plant flowers," she said, not looking up from her drawing. "By the oak tree, so it's not just a grave. It can be a garden, too." Tears pricked my eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a relief so profound it felt like a new kind of birth. My daughter was not planning an escape or building a fortress. She was planning a garden. "Yes," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That's a good idea. A very good idea." And so we did. We turned the earth around that old oak and we planted seeds. Marigolds and lavender, for remembrance and for peace. We tended them together, and as the last of the autumn leaves fell, we watched for the first green shoots to break through the soil. A promise of life returning, of cycles continuing, of a future being built not over the past, but with it, integrated, acknowledged, and finally, at rest. The first frost came, silvering the edges of the marigold leaves we had planted. We covered the tender plants with burlap, a shared ritual of protection against the coming cold. Carla's garden was not just a gesture. It was a practice, a daily, gentle defiance against the silence we had both known. She would talk to the plants, her voice a soft murmur as she checked the soil. And I realized she was speaking to that quiet part of herself, too. The part that waited and wondered. Winter settled in, a deep and hushed season. The world outside was often still, a blanket of white muffling the farm. Inside, the fire crackled, and the lamplight cast a warm, golden glow. We were a family wrapped in a quiet contentment that felt earned, not borrowed. Damon carved Carla a small bird from a piece of scrap wood, and she kept it on the windowsill, a token of the simple, good things that were real. One evening, as a blizzard swirled outside, I was mending a pair of Damon's socks by the fire. Carla was reading aloud from a book of stories, her voice steady and clear. I paused my work, the darning needle held still in my hand, and I listened. I listened to the rhythm of her words, to the snap of the fire, to the wind howling a song of isolation against the sturdy walls of our home. And I felt it then, not as a chilling void, but as a presence. The part of me that was the child in the cane, the part that was the still woman in the mirror, was not a separate thing to be feared. It was the root of my resilience. It was the reason I had fought so hard for this warmth, for this safety. Her terror had forged my strength. Her silence had given weight to my voice. I looked at my daughter, her face intent in the firelight, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that the loop was broken. Not vanished, but transformed. The trauma would not be a ghost she inherited. It would be a story she knew, a story of survival, a story of how her mother had finally turned and faced the dark, and found that it was, and had always been, a part of her own shadow. The storm raged on, but in our home, there was only peace. A real peace, one that could acknowledge the cold outside because the fire within was strong. I picked up my mending again, the needle moving in and out of the wool, a small, steady rhythm of care and repair. I was not waiting for anything anymore. I was simply here, living in the long, unbroken moment of a life I had chosen. A life that was at last completely and wholly my own. Spring arrived not with a shout, but with a slow green sigh. The snow receded, and the earth softened. The marigolds and lavender we had thought lost to the frost sent up brave new shoots, stronger than before. Carla knelt by the oak tree every day, her hands in the dirt, her attention absolute. She was not just tending flowers. She was learning the language of the soil, the patient rhythm of growth. I joined her often, not to instruct, but to share the silence. We would work side by side, the sun warm on our backs, and the only sounds were the scrape of our trowels and the chatter of birds returned to the budding trees. One such afternoon she sat back on her heels, wiping a smear of earth across her cheek. "It doesn't feel like a secret anymore," she said, her gaze fixed on the flourishing plants. "The quiet. It just feels quiet." I nodded, understanding perfectly. The haunting was over. What remained was history. A story woven into the fabric of our lives, its threads dark but necessary. The land itself seemed to breathe easier. The pines stood straighter, the creek ran clearer, and the air held the pure, clean scent of thawed earth and new growth. Life resumed its steady cadence. Planting, weeding, harvesting. The days were full of ordinary, blessed labor. I found I could laugh again. A real, unforced sound that startled me with its ease. I could look at Damon across the dinner table and feel a love that was not layered over with the foundation of fear. I could watch Carla chase fireflies in the twilight and see only a girl at play, not a potential vessel for some inherited sorrow. Months later, on a day thick with summer heat, a traveler came up the road. He was a lean, dusty man leading a tired-looking mule. He tipped his hat as he approached the porch where I was shelling peas. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice rough. "Might I trouble you for a drink of water?" I fetched him a dipper from the bucket. He drank deeply, his Adam's apple bobbing. As he handed it back, his eyes scanned our homestead, taking in the tidy fields, the sturdy house, the garden blooming defiantly under the oak tree. "Fine place you have here," he remarked. "A good, solid life." "It is," I agreed, and for the first time the words were not a shield or a prayer, but a simple statement of fact. He was about to leave when he paused. Squinting back down the road had come. "Quiet around these parts. Peaceful. You're lucky." He shook his head, a shadow passing over his weathered face. "Not like down south. The stories coming out of there. The old plantations, the things that happened in those cane fields." He clicked his tongue. "Enough to haunt a person forever." I stilled, a peapod half-shelled in my hand. The words hung in the humid air between us, not as a threat, but as an echo from a world I had once fled. I looked past him, past the fence line, to where Carla was walking back from the garden, a crown of lavender stems woven through her hair. I met the traveler's gaze, my own steady and clear. "Yes," I said, my voice calm as the deep, still water at the bottom of a well. "I've heard the stories." He nodded, tipped his hat again, and continued on his way. I watched him go until he was a speck on the horizon, swallowed by the shimmering heat. Then I turned back to my peas, the rhythmic pop of the pods a comforting sound. The past was a distant country. Its sorrows were real, its ghosts were valid, but they no longer held the deed to my soul. I was here now, shelling peas on my own porch, in the quiet, sun-drenched peace of a life I had reclaimed. And that was everything. Carla came up the steps, the scent of lavender trailing her. She glanced down the empty road. "Who was that, Mama?" "Just a man passing through," I said. "Needed some water." She accepted this with a nod, her curiosity fleeting. She sat beside me and began to help with the peas, her fingers nimble and quick. The traveler's words had been a stone dropped into the deep pond of my peace, but the ripples were small and faded quickly. They did not disturb the bottom. The ghosts of the cane fields were just that, ghosts. They had no power here. We finished the basket as the sun began to lower, casting long, gentle shadows. That night, after Damon and Carla had gone to bed, I stepped outside alone. The moon was a bright sliver, and the stars were a dizzying spray of light. I walked to the oak tree. The marigolds were closed for the night, their vibrant orange muted to a soft gold in the moonglow. The lavender released its fragrance with every step I took, a perfume of calm. I placed my hand on the rough bark of the tree, feeling its ancient, patient life. I did not speak to the quiet one beneath the soil. There was no need. We had reached an understanding. She was my bedrock, and I was her testament. Her silence had given my life its meaning, its fierce and hard-won joy. A light breeze moved through the branches, and for a moment I fancied it was not a sigh of loss, but a breath of approval. Then it was gone, and there was only the night, vast and beautiful and mine. I turned and walked back to the house, to the warmth of my family, and closed the door behind me. The next morning, the world was drenched in a heavy dew, each blade of grass and spider web glittering under a pristine sun. ADUR. I'm sorry. It was a day like any other, and that was its miracle. I stood at the stove, flipping pancakes, while Damon and Carla set the table, their movements a familiar, comfortable dance. The conversation was light, about the day's chores and the promising clouds on the horizon. Later, while hanging the laundry on the line, I watched Carla in the distance. She was not in the garden, but standing perfectly still at the edge of the field, her face tilted toward the sun. Her hands were open at her sides, not clenched, not waiting. She was simply feeling the day, the warmth on her skin, the solid ground beneath her feet. She was present in a way I had never been at her age, and the sight filled me with a quiet, soaring pride. That afternoon, I went into the storage room to find a length of spare cloth. The room was just as it had been for months, a place of practical things. My gaze did not automatically dart to the corner where the cot had been, nor did I feel a chill when I passed the bare spot on the wall where the mirror had hung. The space held no echo. It was neutral ground. I found the cloth I needed, a sturdy, sun-faded blue, and as I turned to leave, a small dusty object on a high shelf caught my eye. I had to stand on my toes to reach it. It was a small, carved wooden bird, one of Damon's early, rougher attempts. Long since forgot. I dusted it off with my thumb. It was clumsy, its wings not quite even, but it had a kind of earnest charm. I did not see it as a relic of a harder time. I saw it as a testament to the man who had carved it. A man who built and mended and stayed. I brought it into the kitchen and set it on the windowsill beside the one he had made for Carla. The two birds sat side by side, one rough and one smooth. A silent history of our family's journey. Damon saw it when he came in for supper. He didn't say anything, just ran a calloused finger over the older bird's back and gave me a look that held a universe of understanding. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the steady rhythm of Damon's breathing, I realized the last vestige of the held breath had finally left me. My body was no longer a tense string waiting to be plucked. The story was over, and a new one, day by ordinary day, was being written. It was a story without specters, a story of laundry and lavender and a clumsy wooden bird on a windowsill. It was not a dramatic piece, but a durable one. And it was more than enough. The summer heat deepened, pressing down on the land like a warm hand. The corn grew tall and green, rustling with a sound like whispered secrets. But they were benign secrets now, the kind that spoke of growth and sun and rain. I found myself humming while I worked, old hymns and half-remembered songs from a childhood I could now recall without the sharp edge of panic. One evening, Carla brought me a single, perfect lavender stem. "For your pillow," she said, "to help you sleep." I took it, the fragrance instantly calming. "I sleep just fine these days," I told her, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "I know," she said with a small, wise smile. "But it's for the sweetness of your dreams not to chase anything away." Her words settled in me. That was the difference, the fundamental shift. Our actions were no longer about banishment, but about cultivation. We were not fighting the dark. We were simply adding more light. The following week, a letter arrived, a rare event. It was from a distant cousin, the last of my mother's line, writing from a bustling city hundreds of miles away. She wrote of noise and industry, of new machines and crowded streets. She lamented the loneliness of it all, the feeling of being a small, anonymous speck in a roaring crowd. She asked with a tentative hope if life on a farm was as isolated as she feared. I took the letter and sat at the rough-hewn table to write my reply. The words came easily. I did not write of ghosts or mirrors or buried things. I wrote of the satisfaction of a well-tended vegetable patch. I wrote of the profound silence of a snow-covered morning and the chorus of frogs from the creek at dusk. I wrote of the solid weight of my husband's hand in mine and the brilliant, uncomplicated love I had for my daughter. I described a life built not on excitement, but on substance. A life of connection to the land, to a family, to one's own self. As I sealed the letter, I felt no envy for her city life, no lingering desire for a different story. The path that had led me here, with all its terror and its pain, had been the only path that could have led me to this specific, profound contentment. The quiet one in the earth and the child in the cane were not scars. They were the roots, deep and necessary, from which this present peace had grown. I walked to the mailbox at the end of the lane, the sun warm on my shoulders, and sent my truth out into the world. A quiet testament to a battle that had, at long last, been won.